The day my family erased me wasn't loud. There was no shouting, no slammed doors. It happened in a quiet conference room, under fluorescent lights. When my father slid a folder across the table and said my name like it was already in the past, I opened it and saw the truth laid out neatly, my role reassigned, my authority stripped, my signature replaced. They smiled, called it a temporary adjustment, told me it was for my own good. Something inside me cracked, clean and final. Not heartbreak, clarity. I nodded. I thanked them for their honesty. I even shook their hands. Because in that moment, I understood this wasn't a mistake. It was a decision, and decisions can be answered. They thought they were ending something. They had no idea they were starting it. Before I continue, tell me where you're listening from to understand why that moment cut so cleanly. You need to understand the role I'd been trained to play long before that conference room. I was the dependable one, the fixer, the son who didn't cause trouble, didn't ask for much, didn't need applause. I learned early that being useful was safer than being seen. My name is Ethan Hale, and in my family, I was never the favorite, just the most convenient. My father, Richard Hale, built his identity on control, disguised as responsibility. He spoke softly, always reasonable, always reminding everyone how much he sacrificed. My mother, Marianne, was warmth on the surface and pressure underneath. She called it concern. She called it love. But it always came with conditions. Approval was earned, not given. Then there was my younger brother, Caleb, charismatic, impulsive, endlessly forgiven. Where I was expected to be steady, Caleb was allowed to be brilliant and broken. His mistakes were potential. Mine were disappointments. If something went wrong, I fixed it. If something went right, Caleb embodied it. I didn't resent him at first. I told myself families needed balance. Someone had to carry the weight quietly. That became my role in the family business. 2. I worked behind the scenes: contracts, logistics, crisis management. I was good at it. Precise, invisible. When clients praised the team, my parents smiled at Caleb. When something almost collapsed, they called me late at night. I stayed because someone had to keep things standing. The only person who ever noticed the cost was my grandfather, Samuel Hale. He'd watch silently during family dinners, his eyes sharper than anyone gave him credit for. When the room emptied, he'd pour 2 glasses of whiskey and say things like, "You know, competence is often punished in families like ours." He never pushed. He just saw me. Looking back, the manipulation was always there. The guilt-laced compliments, the way boundaries were framed as betrayal, the subtle rewriting of history whenever I objected. "We never asked you to do that," they'd say after benefiting from it. I thought endurance was loyalty. I thought silence was strength. I didn't realize I was being shaped into something disposable. Not until the pressure started tightening and I understood that usefulness, once taken for granted, becomes expectation, and expectation, in my family, was a trap. The shift didn't happen overnight. It never does. Pressure like that is applied gradually, so you don't notice when it becomes unbearable. At first, it was framed as trust, then as necessity. Eventually, it was obligation. After my grandfather's health began to decline, everything accelerated. Richard started looping me into decisions I technically no longer had authority over, but somehow still carried responsibility for. "Just take a look," he'd say. "You're better with details." And I was, which meant every loose end landed in my hands. Invoices started coming to my personal email instead of the company account. Short-term loans, vendor advances, quiet bridges to cover Caleb's impulsive expansions. I was told it was temporary. It always was. I paid them because things would collapse if I didn't. Because someone had to keep the engine running while the driver enjoyed the speed. My mother became the voice of reason, or so she claimed. She'd call late in the evening, her tone gentle. Disappointed. Your father's under so much stress. Caleb's trying so hard. Don't you want to protect the family? Protection was her favorite word. It sounded noble. It felt like a leash. The expectations grew sharper. I was asked to co-sign accounts I didn't control, to move money quietly, to smooth over conversations with partners who were asking too many questions. Every request came with reassurance. This is normal. This is how business works. You're overthinking it. Then came the line I couldn't ignore. Richard asked me to backdate a document. Just a minor adjustment, he said. Everyone does it. The implication was clear if I refused. I wasn't being loyal. I wasn't being a son. I stared at the file on my screen for a long time. My name was already typed at the bottom. Waiting. That was the moment something shifted inside me, not panic. Not anger. Recognition. This wasn't carelessness. It was strategy. They weren't asking because they trusted me. They were asking because I was the only one who would say yes without making noise. The only one who could absorb the risk quietly. I didn't sign it. Not that day. I told them I needed time. Richard frowned. Marianne went silent. Caleb joked it off. But his eyes didn't meet mine. No one argued. They didn't have to. Because I stayed. I kept answering calls. Kept fixing problems. Kept paying for peace with my silence. I told myself I was buying time. That once things stabilized, I'd step back. That it would get easier. But deep down, I knew the truth. They weren't tightening the strings to hold me close. They were tightening them to make sure I couldn't move. The final break came disguised as a formality. Richard asked me to attend a quarterly review at headquarters. Nothing unusual. He said, just optics. When I walked into the room, I noticed two things immediately: a lawyer I didn't recognize, and the absence of my grandfather's chair. That seat had always been empty lately. But this time, it felt intentional. They didn't waste time. The lawyer spoke first, sliding documents across the table with practiced neutrality. A restructuring. A necessary adjustment. My role, effective immediately, was being streamlined. My access limited. My authority redistributed. Mostly to Caleb. I flipped through the pages. My hands steady. My pulse loud in my ears. Clauses I'd written years ago stared back at me. Language I drafted to protect the company in worst-case scenarios. Now it was being used to erase me. This is temporary, my mother said quickly, like she was soothing a child. Once things settle, I looked at my father. He wouldn't meet my eyes. That was the moment. Not when they removed me. Not when Caleb avoided my gaze. But when I realized there was no confusion in the room. No regret. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a rushed decision. It was planned. Carefully. Quietly. With the assumption that I would accept it the way I always had. Something inside me finally broke, not loudly. Not messily. It was the sound of a lock clicking open. Years of self-doubt collapsed into a single, undeniable truth. They weren't pushing me aside because I'd failed. They were doing it because I was no longer useful on my own terms. I stood up, thanked the lawyer, told my family I understood. My mother looked relieved. My father nodded, as if this had gone better than expected. They thought compliance was my nature. What they didn't see was the shift happening under my calm. The sudden clarity. The cold focus. If they could remove me this easily, then everything I'd been protecting was already compromised. And if they thought I would walk away empty-handed, still carrying their weight, they were wrong. This wasn't the end of my role. It was the end of my silence. I didn't confront them. I didn't argue. I went quiet in a way they'd never seen before. The morning after the meeting, I sat alone in my apartment and did something I should have done years earlier. I opened every folder, every email thread, every contract I had ever touched. Not with anger, but with precision. That's when the pattern became undeniable. The vendor guarantees, in my name, the short-term bridge loans, personally signed. The consulting retainers that kept their temporary expansions afloat, billed to my LLC. They hadn't just relied on me. They had built entire safety nets around my credibility. I felt no triumph, just clarity. I called Jonathan Pierce, a senior attorney my grandfather had introduced me to years ago. He listened without interrupting, then said one sentence that changed everything. Ethan, you're not exposed. You're in control. So I acted. Not dramatically. Professionally. I drafted emails measured, courteous, irreversible, notices of withdrawal, terminations of support, non-renewals. Each message cited clauses they themselves had approved, timelines they couldn't contest. I canceled guarantees, redirected payments, declined renewals, one by one. The invisible scaffolding holding their world upright disappeared. I didn't inform my family. I didn't need to. Systems speak louder than accusations. The only person I told was my grandfather. When I visited him, he studied my face for a long moment, then smiled faintly. About time, he said. I was worried you'd mistake endurance for duty forever. His support mattered more than I expected. It grounded me, reminded me I wasn't destroying anything, I was reclaiming it. As the days passed, the internal shift became undeniable. I slept better, thought clearer. The constant low-level dread I'd lived with for years began to dissolve. For the first time, my value wasn't measured by how much I could absorb. It was defined by choice. They still believed I was compliant, quiet, stripped of influence. They hadn't noticed that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, it simply steps back and lets consequences walk forward instead. The confrontation happened in a place designed for movement, not arguments. A glass-walled hotel atrium, downtown, marble floors. Muted music. People passing through with rolling suitcases and coffee cups. Neutral ground. Public. Inescapable. They called the meeting urgent, confused, angry. By the time I arrived, my parents were already there, seated too close together. Caleb stood near the windows, phone pressed to his ear, pacing. They all looked smaller than I remembered. Not weaker, just exposed. My mother spotted me first. Ethan, she said, standing too quickly. Thank God. We need to talk. I know. I replied calmly, taking the seat across from them. I placed my briefcase on the table. That's why I'm here. My father leaned forward, his voice tight. Accounts are frozen. Vendors are pulling out. We need you to fix whatever misunderstanding this is. Caleb snapped his phone shut. This isn't funny anymore. I waited. Let the silence stretch just long enough to shift the balance. Then Jonathan Pierce joined us, setting a slim folder on the table. The color drained from my mother's face. A lawyer, she whispered. As if I'd brought a weapon, Jonathan smiled politely. I'm here to clarify facts. My father bristled. This is a family matter. It stopped being one when contracts were involved. Jonathan said evenly. I opened the briefcase and slid copies across the table, documents they'd never read carefully because they'd trusted me to handle them. My name, my signatures, my entities. Jonathan spoke calmly, clinically. Mr. and Mrs. Hale. Over the past 7 years, Ethan personally guaranteed or directly funded 73% of your operational liquidity. Those agreements have now been legally and properly withdrawn. My mother's hands began to shake. You can't do that. I already did, I said. Caleb laughed. sharp and hollow. You're bluffing. Jonathan met his eyes. He isn't. The realization hit them one by one. Not all at once. My father went rigid first, his jaw locking as calculations ran through his head. My mother followed, tears forming not from loss, but from disbelief. Caleb's anger curdled into panic. You planned this, my mother said, accusing. I shook my head. No, you did. I just stopped absorbing the damage. My father's voice dropped. You're punishing us. No, I replied. I'm stepping out of a role you never had the right to assign. People walked past us, unaware that an entire family hierarchy was collapsing at a cafe table. Jonathan slid one final document forward. This outlines formal boundaries. Any further attempts to access Ethan's assets, accounts, or professional reputation will be treated as legal violations. My mother sobbed quietly now. I don't understand when you became so cold. I met her eyes, not cruel, not angry. Clear? I didn't become cold. I became finished. Caleb slammed his palm on the table. So you just walk away? After everything I stood? I already did. I said, this meeting is a courtesy, not a negotiation. My father looked up at me then. Really looked. For the first time. There was no authority in his gaze. Only fear. You'll regret this, he said weakly. I picked up my briefcase. No. I'll finally stop paying for things that were never mine to carry. Jonathan nodded once and stepped back. As I walked toward the exit, the revolving doors caught the light, spinning steadily. No one followed. No one called my name. And when I stepped outside, the city noise rushed in cars, voices, life in motion. I didn't look back. Because power isn't proven by who stays at the table. It's proven by who knows when to leave it. The aftermath was quieter than I expected. There were no dramatic apologies, no late-night confessions, no sudden self-awareness. What followed was consequence slow, procedural, unavoidable. Contracts dissolved, projects stalled. The business shrank into something more honest, less inflated by borrowed stability. My parents were forced to confront decisions they'd postponed for years. Caleb, stripped of the safety net beneath his ambition, had to finally learn the weight of his own choices. And my grandfather Samuel was protected. That mattered most to me. His remaining assets were secured, his care formalized, his peace no longer leveraged as emotional currency. When I visited him, he squeezed my hand and said, "You didn't burn anything down. You just stopped holding up a collapsing ceiling." He was right. As for me, life didn't magically transform overnight. Healing wasn't cinematic. It was practical. I slept without bracing for the next call. I worked without feeling like my value depended on rescue. I started consulting independently, not because I needed to prove anything, but because I finally could choose. I learned something unexpected in the quiet that followed. Freedom isn't loud. It doesn't demand witnesses. Sometimes it's just the ability to sit with yourself without rehearsing defenses. My family still exists in my life, but at a distance that keeps us all honest. Conversations are shorter. Expectations are clearer. Love, when it shows up now, doesn't arrive disguised as obligation. Looking back, I understand this now. Revenge doesn't always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like boundaries enforced, support withdrawn, silence where manipulation once thrived. Choosing yourself isn't cruel. It's corrective. If you've ever been the reliable one, the quiet one, the person who held everything together while slowly disappearing inside, know this: you're allowed to step back. You're allowed to change the terms. You're allowed to leave the table and build something that doesn't require your erasure to survive. And if this story resonated with you, stay. There are more like it. Stories about reclaiming ground, redefining loyalty, and learning that self-respect is not abandonment. Sometimes, the most powerful ending isn't an explosion. It's a life that finally belongs to you.